thank you for being here. And I've got to introduce a couple people before I get started, and that is my staff, the staff of the Freedom Foundation. If you all stand, I think some of you have been recognized, but not all of you, and I'd like to have a round of applause for my staff. These are the freedom fighters. Thank you. They are happy warriors. And my wife is with me tonight. I always introduce Susan. Susan, my wife, thank you for being here. Some of you know that Susan was educated in Ivy League colleges, Columbia University. I was not. And she married down, and I'm very happy about that. In any event, I want to tell you a little something about our lives. Susan and I have been sued many, many times because of my political activity in Washington State. The most dreadful lawsuit that we faced was a lawsuit that was brought by the Attorney General of Washington State. Getting sued, by the way, by government is frightening. In this case, which was a case of, they were accusing us of campaign finance violations, the government attorneys hated me because of my political beliefs. And they claimed in court that I had committed criminal acts. They said that I was no different than a drug dealer or a child molester. And I actually did, I feared that the Attorney General would not stop prosecuting until I was in prison or until BIW, the organization I was running at the time, was bankrupt. And one night I told Susan about my fear, and she is a person of faith, and she said something to me I'll never forget. She said, "God can take a curse and make it a blessing." Of course, I had my doubts. Well, as the case continued, we realized that we needed a high-powered attorney, someone who had gone through battles like this before. So I asked around in the conservative network with colleagues of mine in the conservative movement, and they all recommended Cleta Mitchell. They told me that she was the best First Amendment attorney in the United States. And to my amazement, Cleta agreed to represent us. And she came out to Washington, and after she reviewed the case file, and after she talked to the Attorney General, she came back to my office and she said that I had done absolutely nothing wrong. She told me that we were being prosecuted because we were effective. In fact, she said, if you don't want the left to attack you, just do nothing, like all the other business groups in the country. Cleta was a superb lawyer, the best lawyer I ever had, and she was tenacious in the courtroom. Sadly, the judge in our case was corrupt, and he ruled against us. So I had to suffer the indignity of settling with the government, even though I had done nothing wrong. And of course, I went home and asked my wife, "Where's this blessing you were talking about?" Cleta, by the way, this was many years ago, she went on to become famous, as you all know. She works for virtually every big conservative group in the country, Heritage Action, the National Rifle Association, Freedom Works. She became the lawyer for well-known conservatives who were running for the U.S. Senate in the last 4 or 5 election cycles. Most of those candidates that she worked for won. She was named by the National Journal as one of the 20 most influential women in Washington, D.C. The list included Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, and Nancy Pelosi, and then there was Cleta. And as you know, because you've seen her on TV undoubtedly, she exposed the IRS scandal. And of course, you know that story. Obama's IRS was threatening, harassing, and trying to defund conservative groups during election cycles. She sued the IRS, and she persuaded Congress to investigate. Cleta's on TV all the time, on CNN, Fox News. Actually, she probably could be on ESPN too, because she's a great baseball student. In any event, here's the weird thing, though. Here's the weird thing. Despite her fame, she still remembered Susan and me. And she would regularly contact us and call us and ask how she could help us. She went on to introduce me to many famous conservatives, George Will and others. When I took this job, she contacted me and said, I'm going to connect you with some national donors. Those national donors are now supporting the Freedom Foundation. So, and one day, I think it was last spring, I realized something, and I realized that my wife had been right, that the curse of that horrible lawsuit from the Attorney General had turned into a blessing, and Cleta was that blessing. And without that lawsuit, I would have never met Cleta. Without that lawsuit, I would have never made a lifelong friend. So, tonight, please join me in giving a Freedom Foundation welcome to my friend and my blessing, Cleta Mitchell.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to all of you. You've all been so warm and friendly to a girl from Oklahoma who has come to just share an evening with you about some things that matter to all of us. And I'll talk about Tom a little bit more in just a moment. But I asked Tom what he wanted me to talk about, and he said, anything you want. This is dangerous. And I thought about talking about the IRS scandal, and I will be happy to answer questions about it later, but I don't want to ruin a perfectly lovely evening by talking about Lois Lerner, John Koskinen, and all of that mess. So instead, I want to talk tonight about work. Not jobs, not careers, not networking. I want to talk about the value of work and the principles of work and how the left in this country is devaluing work and severing the ties between work and freedom and trying to destroy our country in the process. It is fitting to talk about work at the Freedom Foundation because work equals freedom. And I don't think we as conservatives talk enough about work. Now remember Maynard G. Krebs, I'm really dating myself. Whenever he said work in the Dobie Gillis show, how many of you people remember this? You'll date yourselves too, thank you. And whenever he said work, he'd go, work? Well, that's a bit what's happening in our country. It's brought on by these leftists. We have let the left capture the conversation about work, and we have to reclaim it. We have to talk about the importance and the beauty and the value of work, and every job has value. And we let the left talk about jobs and work as though there's something wrong with it, and as though the people who are providing those jobs are doing a disservice to the people who have the jobs. And we have to stop letting them get away with that, because the ability to work hard and to be and do all that you want to be and do is uniquely American, and it is what has built this country. I was a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard in the fall of 1981. And I grew up in Oklahoma, and I grew up in the flat western part of Oklahoma. I was actually there 2 weeks ago, and man, if you haven't been there in a while, you forget how flat that place really is. It is flat, and it is windy. And but there's sort of this notion in Oklahoma, the wide open spaces, and when you can see for a zillion miles and there are no trees, you really can see forever. And I grew up with the notion of the wide open spaces. That's where I'm from. And I realized when I went to Harvard, I was a 31-year-old state legislator, and I went down to call on the Speaker of the Massachusetts House because I was a House member, and you kind of do those things. And he puts me up on the dais, and all these legislators kept coming up to me for the afternoon, and they'd come up and say, "Who's your father? Who's your grandfather?" That's my Oklahoma accent, trying to be a Boston accent. But they could not, I kept saying, well, nobody. They're nobody. And they could not get through their heads that this 31-year-old nobody could be a state legislator and chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. Because in their world, and this is true in the northeastern part of the state, they were 300 years old. Oklahoma was not even, we're a young state. We were the Indian Territory. You're not supposed to say Indian, I guess, anymore, but that's what they called it. And I began to, and I realized sometimes you have to be out of your surroundings before you learn something, and I realized that the notion of the wide open spaces was a mentality. It wasn't just geography. And where I come from, you can do and be whatever you are hoss enough to do and be. And that is something that I believe that America is all about. The ability to work and to become independent, whether it's independent of your parents or your family, or of union bosses who take and spend your money without your consent on things that you don't approve of. It is important for us to talk about the dignity of work and to be proud to have jobs and to talk about how important every paycheck is. And I am really tired of listening to union bosses demean the jobs and the paid work that their members do. And I think we have to stand up and talk about that because the left is intent upon denying that right to as many Americans as they possibly can. And their assault on work is staggering. They're doing it through the courts, they're doing it through the NLRB, they're doing it through Congress and state legislatures and state and city councils. They are intent upon destroying the engines of job creation under the guise of protecting workers. And it's time that we join the Freedom Foundation in standing up and speaking out and stopping the liberal, left, progressive, Democrats, unions, socialists, communists. They're all the same. I don't care what you want to call them. We have to stop them from destroying the essence of what built our country and made it great, which is hard work. Now, this goes back a long time. Let me read to you what St. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. I'm not going to read you all of it, but it's important. But it's important every now and then to remember this. Paul wrote, "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to that teaching that you received from us. You yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were there with you. Did we eat anyone's food without paying for it? On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling so that we would not be a burden to any of you. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat." We hear that some among you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy, they are busy bodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. And on St. Paul goes. It sounds a lot like my mother. My mother taught her 6 kids the value and necessity of work. She taught us by example. She worked my whole life. My father had a college degree, but he was a no count. He couldn't or wouldn't hold a job, so my mom was responsible for both supporting and raising her 6 kids. Now, she was a child of the Depression, and I was raised with pretty clear ideas and understandings about jobs and work. If you don't want that job, there are 100 people in line behind you that want that job. Now, don't you be late. If you're late to work, then they're going to fire you, and then one of those 100 people is going to get that job. You need to be grateful every day that you have that job, because that's a paycheck, and you need to be grateful for that paycheck. Now, that's what I was raised with. My favorite story is that the first Saturday after I finished the 7th grade, June of 1962, my mother looked at me and said, "So, what are you going to do this summer?" I said, "Well, I guess I was going to do what I do every summer, which is not a lot. Watch TV, read, take care of I had 2 little brothers and a little sister that I took care of while she worked. And we lived very far out of town in a little neighborhood that had about 20 houses, and we were surrounded by dairy farms and pastures. And so I wasn't going anywhere. And so my mother said, "You need to get a job." I said, "I can't get a job?" She said, "Sure you can." I said, "Mother, I'm 12. She said, "I'll get you a job." She said, "I'm not going to have a teenager lying around the house all day while I'm at work." So my mother went door to door in the neighborhood, and she cobbled together enough babysitting and house cleaning jobs that she kept me busy all summer. And she took my little brothers and sister to stay with my grandmother while she worked. The value of work, the importance of work, is one of the most important and meaningful gifts my mother gave me. My mother died 10 years ago last week, and she had told me that she had all of her important papers were in this metal box. So after she died, I was going through her papers with her will and her insurance papers and all. My mother was a clerk typist, a very proud, great secretary for many years. And when she would find something she liked, she would get out her typewriter, which she got when she retired. They gave her a typewriter. And she would type little pieces of paper with sayings. And I found some sayings. But I found this one, and I carry it in my billfold with me every day, at all times. It is a quote from Charles Kingsley. "Thank God every morning when you get up that you have something to do that day, which must be done whether you like it or not. Being forced to work and forced to do your best will breed in you temperance and self-control, diligence and strength of will, cheerfulness and content, and 100 virtues which the idle never know." That was my mom. When I first met my husband, we've now been married 31 and a half years. Well, let me just say this to go to a point that Tom made. My husband played baseball, and his father was a Major League Baseball player. And my husband says the only reason he married me was because I was the first girl who knew the infield fly rule. But he said something early on when we first started going out, something that I had been saying for years. He made some comment, "Work is a blessing." He just said that in passing, and I knew right then that we were soulmates. That, and the fact that he felt the same way I did about Oklahoma State University, Tulsa, and Pepsi. We are Sooners from Oklahoma City, and we drink Coca-Cola. But work is a blessing. Abraham Lincoln wrote and spoke at length in his public career about work. You should look it up. He has written and spoken beautifully about the importance of celebrating work and labor. We as Americans, he said, have been blessed with the gift of hard work translating and equating to upward mobility, to independence, and to freedom. In an address he gave to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society, September 30th of 1859, Lincoln said, quote, "The prudent, penniless beginner in the world labors for wages a while, saves a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, then labors on his own account for a while, and at length hires another new beginner to help him. This, say its advocates, is free labor, the just and generous and prosperous system which opens the way for all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and improvement of condition to all." He also said in that speech, "No country can sustain in idleness more than a small percentage of its numbers. The great majority must labor at something productive." It was in no small part because of Lincoln's strong belief that a man should reap the benefits of his labors that he so abhorred slavery. And I must tell you, one of my favorite campus political correctness stories is that there is a plaque at the University of Illinois, it's dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, son of Illinois, Democrat. Now, when some of the students went to the administration and said, Abraham Lincoln was the founder of the Republican Party, they thought about it and came back, and this was their answer. They would not change the engraving on the plaque because they said if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, he would be a Democrat. You can't make this stuff up on the college campuses. Look, I am not standing here tonight telling you that there haven't been abuses of laborers, mistreatment of workers, hideous working conditions that have been endured by workers throughout history. We all know that. And I'm not standing here telling you that all workplaces are kind, humane, and plush, because we all know that's not true. I'm going to write a book someday called Crazy People I Have Worked For. Because I have worked for some real Lulus. But we know that the labor union movement has served a useful purpose for many workers in many occupations for a time. But the labor union movement has evolved today into a single-minded force that is destroying work, and rather than empowering workers, is intent upon destroying individual initiative and work opportunities for those in our society who are least able to sustain these union assaults on their rights, on their freedom, and on their independence. And we have to take up their cause just as the Freedom Foundation is doing. It matters. And let's start with the public employee unions, although I have to say they are morphing from being public employee unions to basically trying to destroy every aspect of our economy. So we know that because of some court decisions, some black-robed tyrants who said that public employees have a property interest in their jobs so that they cannot be fired or disciplined without due process. So we know how hard it is to fire or to discipline a public employee. According to James Scherer, who is a labor expert at the Heritage Foundation, in fiscal year 2013, the average time to terminate a federal worker was 1.5 years, 18 months average. It is no wonder that the federal government that fiscal year terminated only 0.26% of tenured employees for poor performance or misconduct, which is less than 1/5 the number in the private sector. I have a great friend, Patrick Pizzella, who is a true character, and he was appointed about 18 months ago to be the Republican member of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority governs federal employee unions, like the NLRB governs private sector unions. So since Pat's confirmation as the Republican member, it's a 3-member board, and the majority is always the same party as the White House. So Pat is the Republican member. He sends out these dissents that he writes to these cases. And if it were not so outrageous and maddening, they are really hilarious and brilliant. I'm going to share with you a couple of stories. One, and I mention this because both of these are from the Veterans Administration. Many of the dissents that he has circulated involve situations like I'm going to tell you about at the Veterans Administration. So there was this nurse at the VA who was disciplined for spending 6 hours of a 30-hour work week surfing the internet reading sports websites. And what brought it to the attention of his supervisors is that he kept saying that they were understaffed. And he finally threatened to file a union grievance if they didn't get more staffing on his unit. So the supervisor goes down to check out what's going on in the staffing on this unit at a VA hospital and finds this nurse who's complaining about being understaffed sitting on the VA computers reading sports scores on the ESPN website. And so the supervisor disciplined this employee, who of course went to the union, who of course brought a grievance, brought an action, and the arbitrator, of course, agreed with the union. The VA appealed that to the FLRA, and the two Democrats upheld the arbitrator and said, no problem. There was another case, also with the VA. I thought that I would pick the VA cases since they're in the news a lot. Another dissent that Pat, my friend, wrote. There was this guy who applied for a chaplain position and received the appointment as a VA chaplain. However, he had forgotten or didn't know that once he became a chaplain, that was considered a supervisory position. And it meant two things. Number one, that he was no longer a member of the bargaining unit because he was a supervisor. And number two, that he would not be entitled to overtime pay. And he decided that he hadn't counted on getting called out at 2 a.m. to be a chaplain. Now, grieving and dying in the VA hospital kind of doesn't happen necessarily between 9 and 5. So he went to the union. Now, he's no longer a member of the bargaining unit, and gets the union to represent him anyway, files a grievance and says he's entitled to overtime pay. Again, the arbitrators, it's a real racket. This whole thing is a real racket. And the arbitrator agrees with the union. The two Democrats uphold the arbitrator. These dissents, like I say, are brilliant dissents, but they tell a really scary story about federal employees. There was a GAO study released last year that found, I want you to listen carefully, that federal employees spent in 1 year, 2013, 2.48 million hours working for their labor unions while getting paid by the taxpayers. There were more than 360 workers on the federal payroll who spent 100% of their time that year working for their union. And we're at the mercy of these agencies who are populated by people who can't be fired no matter how poor their performances are, and we subsidize their wages and benefits, and we seemingly have no recourse because our leaders, even our conservative leaders, are afraid to take on these public employee unions. And there's no wonder. Just think back about those mobs in Madison when Scott Walker proposed and got passed Act 10. Now, that was a hugely meaningful piece of legislation. It limited collective bargaining. It requires annual recertification of every union and every bargaining union. It stopped the automatic deduction from the payrolls of union dues, and it forbids the union from requiring people represented in the bargaining unit to have to be members of the union. And what's happened? The numbers of union members in Wisconsin's public employee ranks has plummeted. Some estimates are that 100,000 fewer public employees belong to the union than before Act 10, with an estimated $60 million less in union dues. We know they had at least $2 million less to spend in Wisconsin in 2014 through their PAC than they'd had the 2 years before. I want to share one little personal story with you. When I was in the legislature a long time ago, I was chairman of the Appropriations and Budget Committee, this is the early 80s, and our governor decided that he wanted to, and I was a Democrat then. I was, but I believe in conversion and redemption. And the governor had urged a study of state employee compensation. That's a reasonable thing to do, to compare state employee compensation to private sector employees. Now, I was only in my early 30s, but I will tell you, this is one of the stupidest things I have ever seen in my life. So we go to the meeting where they're presenting this, and I'm looking at this report and these experts, and we have paid tens of millions of dollars to these experts who have done this study. And that was 1982, 81, 82. And I asked the question, did you look at non-monetary compensation? Well, no, they hadn't looked at that. They just looked at salary. They didn't look at leave. They didn't look at benefits of any kind. So I convinced the state legislative leadership to appropriate a few $100,000 to at least just look at non-monetary or non-cash compensation. Leave, that sort of thing. And we found, this is in the early 1980s, the average state employee had, this is an average, so there are people who had more, 42 paid days of absence per year. That's more than 2 months. So I proposed a bill to completely rework the way we dealt with leave and sick leave and annual leave, to reduce it, require that you had to work there for a while before you could have the maximum, which would be 3 weeks, create incentives for people to save and bank their sick leave, which we didn't do. And you would have thought that I had proposed stealing the firstborn of every state employee. I missed the last episode of MASH because I had agreed to go to a state employee town hall meeting where there were hundreds of state employees yelling at me for this bill. I couldn't get a single other member of the legislature to co-author it with me. You talk about dead on arrival, that bill was dead on arrival. But I'll never forget the employee who stood up and said, I don't understand why you're doing this, why you're proposing that you restrict our leave time. He said, it doesn't matter whether I'm there or not. I said, well, gee, is your supervisor here? Can I'll try not to tell your supervisor. It's like when they announced this in Washington, D.C. If there's an ice storm, they announce all non-essential federal employees can stay home. I'm thinking, I would never stay home if they announced that. But people are proud to be non-essential in Washington, D.C. And you read about the unions, they seem to know that they are. I was reading some articles which led me to want to talk about this, but there are union leaders in the country who understand that the unions are on the verge of extinction. And they are trying to find ways, and they understand that these defunding efforts are going on. And I did read, be ready for this, that they are starting to supplement their income through contributions from these big left-wing foundations and wealthy donors like George Soros. So we need to keep worrying about defunding them, but we need to make sure that we know that there are a lot of wealthy left-wingers who will continue to try to keep them afloat. But you're here in the belly of the beast. You're here where the $15 minimum wage movement began. And if Tom had only had just a couple more weeks if they'd come and gotten you and Brian 2 weeks earlier, it wouldn't have passed by 77 votes, and we wouldn't have to be dealing with this all over the country. But the SEIU and these unions are targeting every industry that gives people who don't have great skills, that gives young people, immigrants, people an opportunity to start on that first step of the American dream ladder. They are targeting the food and restaurant industry to the point that, and you know, the food and restaurant industry is hugely important in this country. 1 in 12 workers is related somehow to the food and restaurant industry. 50% of Americans are said to have worked in a restaurant or in a food industry at some time in their lives, and fully 25% of Americans got their first job in a restaurant. I remember my daughter, when she was 15, my mother did it to me when I was 12. My daughter at least got to be 15 before I did it to her. I said, I'm not going to have a teenager laying around my house while I'm at work. So she put on a dress and went down and gave an application to the new little restaurant that had opened down the street from us. And this guy looked at her and said, how old are you? She said, 15. He said, is it legal for me to hire you? She said, I don't know. He said, I don't either, but you're hired. I need you. And she worked for that restaurant, and the owner of that restaurant was one of her college application recommenders. And she learned important, valuable lessons from that restaurant. She learned, for instance, that she would get better tips if she put on her makeup and fixed her hair. And the next summer, when she worked at a restaurant in Philadelphia where she went to school, she went to work for a French restaurant, and she called me outraged because she said they pulled tips. She said, it is outrageous. It doesn't matter if I'm looking good and I do all the work and all. These people who don't do anything, they get the same tips I do. I said, welcome to socialism. These are important life lessons. The labor unions have set their sights on the restaurant industry. And they've set their sights on the child care workers, and they've set their sights on domestic workers, and they've set their sights on not on helping to celebrate the fact that these people have jobs and they have employers who are giving them honorable work. They make it sound as though it is a disgrace that they have those jobs, and we have to not let them get away with saying things like that. And the NLRB's ruling in August that said, this is something the left has been trying to do for a long time, and the Obama administration has been intent upon, where employees of franchisees can be deemed to be, that the franchisors can be deemed to be joint employers, so that they can hopefully create bargaining units and go after the franchisors. And think about, this is a uniquely American business model, the franchise industry. And we know how the labor unions hate that. And they hate Walmart. And now they hate the Indian tribes. They hate anybody who either doesn't want to or isn't legally capable of becoming part of their, subject to their control. You know, I read on the way out here yesterday, or maybe the day before, that Seattle, your lovely city, well, not all of you, but where they're now talking about forcing the drivers, the Lyft and the Uber drivers, to be employees. Now, I don't know if any of you take Uber. I love Uber. I love Uber. And I always, you know, in Washington, D.C., you know, and what they've done, what Uber has done to New York City, you know, those taxi medallions, that has been a racket. I mean, a real corrupt racket for many, many decades. And now, because of competition and because Uber has come in, the value of those taxi medallions has been decreased from tens of thousands of dollars to virtually nothing. And of course, the people who paid that big money are pretty mad about it. But I always ask my Uber drivers in Washington, where are you from? One weekend I had I went to Philadelphia, went from Washington to Philadelphia and back in. I had 3 different Uber drivers. They were all from Ethiopia. And I learned that was the Ethiopian New Year. I wouldn't have known that. But I always ask them about being an Uber driver. They love it. I love the independence. I love the way it helps me be able to take care of my family. I can drive when I want to drive. I don't have to drive when I don't want to drive. I like being my own boss. This is what the unions want to do away with. They hate that idea of freedom and independence. So, look, I mean, there's no one in the country better equipped to be the person who leads this fight against the unions than Tom McCabe, because he is he is the smartest, most principled conservative I think I've ever met. And I will tell you the reason that he hired me was not because I was a great lawyer, but I was in my office at 5:30 on Friday night of Labor Day weekend, so he called me. But at my daughter's high school commencement, former Secretary of State James Baker was the speaker. And his theme was, leadership is knowing what to do and then doing it. That's Tom McCabe. He knows what to do. He knows what the fight is. He knows how important this is. And he's willing to do it. He knows what to do, and he's doing it. And he does it with a great staff. He always hires and inspires a great team. And he does it with your help. And he knows that this is what we have to do to preserve freedom. And I want to close as a final thought. How many of you have read the book, The Boys in the Boat, 9 Americans in Their Quest for Olympic Gold in the 1936 Berlin Olympics? How many of you read it? All right, how many of you have not read it? All right, your assignment. It is a most incredible book. If you don't, I'm not going to tell you all of it, but it's about the University of Washington rowing team in the 1930s, and most of what happened took place not far from here. But you cannot read that book without being struck by the hard work, the agonizing, brutal, determined, insanely difficult work that the team members and their coaches endured, not just on the water, but in their lives. The hard scrabble lives that they lived, the jobs, the work that they had to engage in to survive during the Depression. It not only fed them, it sustained and built their character. And that is the story of America. The blessings of freedom come from hard work, and there's nothing wrong with those entry-level jobs that prepare us all for the next dream that we may have. Somebody asked how many of you had a minimum wage job for your first job. Are you kidding me? My high dollar level of babysitting, I mean, I didn't just work the summer after 7th grade. I did that every summer until I graduated. December, I graduated from high school. My high dollar mark was 60 hours a week. 5 days, 10 hours a day, 5 days, how many days? Whatever it was, 60 hours a week, 50 hours a week, $12.50 a week. And I was happy to have that money because my mother told me I needed to be happy to have that money. And I'll just share one last story with you. My husband and I were on an NRA, I was a speaker on an NRA cruise a few years ago, and we docked in Monaco. And we didn't have one of those shore excursions planned. We decided we'd just get off and kind of wander into town with this other couple. So we got off the boat, and there was this nicely dressed gentleman, and he had a minivan, and he spoke English and said, "Would you like me to show you around today?" And we said, "Well, yeah, he seems like a nice fellow." So he showed us around, and we were sitting at lunch with him and asking him questions about his life and all. And his name was Francois, of course. And he took us all around Nice, and it was a beautiful day. And he was a single father with 2 teenage sons. He sold coffee to restaurants, good coffee to fine restaurants, he said, very proud of that. And on his days off, he would bring his minivan and see if he could get people like us to hire him to take him around to earn extra money. He said his goal for his sons, his 2 teenage boys, was that they could come to America. He said because in France, no matter how hard you work, you can't ever go up. And he knew, and we know, that in America, If you work hard, you can go up. And that is the truth. It's been true for our entire history, and it is true today. And those politicians and those union leaders bosses who tell people, this is the best you're ever going to do, there's nothing you can do, you're being mistreated, America's got it in for you, they are lying. And we can't let them keep saying those things without fighting back. So I wish you all the best of luck as you fight these hideous, horrible people who are trying to destroy our country. But I know that with your help, supporting Tom McCabe and the Freedom Foundation, we are going to win this battle. God bless you.